Thank you, Chrissy, and welcome everyone to our annual Uniform Guidance Update. As you all know, there's always something going on in the world of uniform guidance, and we are happy to share it with you. So before we jump on into materials, we're going to introduce ourselves here. So if we could go over to that next slide. My name is Melissa Galesso, and I'm a director in the Audit Professional Practices Department for Bekaert, and I'm out of the Charlotte office. But the person that's going to really shine today is Laura. Laura, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Harden. I am a senior manager in the Government Services Group, and I am located in our Virginia Beach office.
We are excited to have you here, Laura, to talk about some of these changes and to walk us through some of the nitty-gritty. I know you work with a lot of governments, and there's always something that we need to be keeping on our back of our mind as we're going through this. And today we'll even talk about some of the proposed changes that people should be paying attention to. All right, so let's move on. Let's have you turn it over to Laura, who's going to tell us a little bit about our learning objectives.
Okay, so today our learning objectives are that we are going to, at the end of this, you'll be able to list the 5 approved methods of procurement. You'll also be able to identify changes to single audits as well as describe common deficiencies. And I am going to turn it quickly back over to Melissa.
All right, so before we dive on into that material here, we want to get our first polling question out there. And so we just kind of want to get a feel for who we have here on the line. So do we have a public school or university, city, county, or town, not-for-profit entity, or other entity? And so again, we want you to take some time to tell us who you are. That helps us to kind of adjust our presentation here. And there are quite a few of you on the line from a lot of different areas, it looks like, which is pretty cool as we go through this, trying to see what we have out there. So it looks like you have mostly voted, but I'm going to give you just a couple more seconds to make sure you do submit that polling question. That is how we determine whether you are eligible for CPE. I am sure most of you are here just to get the amazing learning that Laura is going to offer, but the CPE is a nice bonus here. All right, let me close this out and I'm going to broadcast those results. So we have a pretty diverse mix here, about 40% of you coming from a city, county, or town. And then if you combine the public school or university with the not-for-profit entity, you get to about 49% there as well. And then 15% coming from other. So not surprising given the client base that Bekaert works with. So I think this is pretty consistent. So thank you guys so much for sharing our very first poll question.
Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about today are what the key changes were that came about as a part of uniform guidance. So the first key change that I'm going to talk about is internal controls, and this is covered in section 200.303 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And here, what really the biggest change was that this section clarified what the meaning of must and should are. And so must meaning that these are things that aren't optional. Every entity needs to be doing those. And then the should items are things that are recommended. So really those things that are going to be best practices for your organization. Some of the items that each non-federal entity must do are establish and maintain effective internal control over their federal awards to provide reasonable assurance that they're managing it in compliance with federal statute, regulations, and the terms and conditions of that federal award. In addition to that, it also states that they must comply with the requirements, that they must evaluate and monitor that compliance, and if there are any instances of non-compliance, that they're taking prompt action over those. They also must take reasonable measure to safeguard or protect PII or other sensitive information. So some of the best practices should items are that they should be in compliance with the standards for internal control in the federal government that were issued by the Comptroller General or of the United States, or the Internal Control Integrated Framework that was issued by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, or COSO. The next key change has to do with time and effort reporting, and this is covered in section 200.430. And what the biggest change here is that uniform guidance now offers new flexibilities for time and effort tracking. This is in an effort to reduce the burden for the entities, but as a part of that, it does require strong internal controls to ensure accountability. So these internal controls for compensation must provide reasonable assurance that the time being charged to its grants is accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. The next key change has to do with required certifications. These items are covered in section 200.415, and required certifications are to assure expenditures are proper and in accordance with the terms and conditions of the award. So the annual and final fiscal reports or vouchers requesting payments must include a signed certification that's signed by an official who is authorized to legally bind the non-federal entity. So it's really recommended that each organization should review and adjust their policies to ensure that those people who are responsible for signing these reports are actually authorized to legally bind the organization. The next key change had to do with subrecipient monitoring, and this is covered in section 200.331. Under this, pass-through entities are required to evaluate the subrecipient's risk and determine appropriate monitoring activities based on that risk assessment. So this section specifies what's mandatory to be done for all subrecipients, as well as some optional monitoring policies that are based on that risk assessment that is being performed. The items that must be done are, they are required to review financial and performance reports, following up and ensuring that the subrecipient takes timely and appropriate action on all deficiencies, as well as issuing a management decision for federal award audit findings. The optional monitoring, these are the things that are based on that risk assessment that is done. So depending on how risky you determine the subrecipient to be, you may want to do one of these things, a couple of these things, all of them. So really based on that risk level. And these are to help to ensure proper accountability and compliance by the subrecipient. These items can be things such as providing training and technical assistance, performing on-site reviews, or arranging for agreed upon procedures engagements for your subrecipient. The next key change that I'm going to talk about is indirect costs, which are covered in section 200.414. And under this section, it states that federal agencies and pass-through entities must accept an indirect facilities and administration cost that's negotiated with a federal agency, or they need to notify the Office of Management and Budget as to why the negotiated rate is not accepted and make publicly available the criteria to support that deviation. This updated guidance also allowed for a one-time extension for the organization's current negotiated indirect cost rate for a period of up to 4 years. So now we're going to cover probably what was the biggest change, the most significant one was over procurement, and this is covered in sections 200.317 to 326. We're going to go into that a little bit further on the next few slides. Okay, so procurement. This was effective for as of July 1st of 2018 for June year ends and January 1st of 2018 for December year ends. So these standards are now applicable. There were no more extensions that were given. So your entity should have these in place. Now, if you happen to be a state, the procurement guidelines requirements are covered in section 200.317, and it talks about property and services purchases must follow the same policies and procedures used for procurements from their non-federal funds. So whatever your policies are for anything that is non-federal, you're using that for your federal purchases. Additionally, it states that they must comply with section 200.322, which is the procurement of recovered materials, which we are going to cover that in a later slide. And then lastly, they must ensure all clauses required by section 200.326 are included in each applicable purchase order or other contract. So if you are not a state, then for all other non-federal entities, we're going to cover what those requirements are for them. The first being that for any non-federal entities, they must have documented procedures, and those procedures must reflect the applicable regulations, provided that the procurements conform to the applicable federal law and standards identified in these sections. So first, we're going to talk about contractors and the oversight that you're required to have. So if you are using a contractor, you are required to maintain oversight to make sure that they're performing in accordance with the contract for the purchase order. So somebody in your entity needs to be responsible for actually following up and making sure that the contractors are doing what is in that contract. Conflict of interest. So there need to be written standards that cover this and the actions of employees who are engaged in the selection, the award, and the administration of contracts. Employees shouldn't be participating in the contract process if there is either a real or apparent conflict of interest. So that means if the employee, for an example, has an immediate family member who has a financial interest from a firm that's being considered for a contract, then they should not be participating in that process. It's really also very important to note that conflict of interest doesn't just apply to the individual, it also applies to the organization. So an example of this would be that if the organization has a relationship with a subsidiary organization, then the non-federal entity is unable to, or appears to be unable to be impartial. So even if it's, I guess, not that real conflict of interest, if it is apparent, if it seems that way from somebody on the outside, then there would be a conflict of interest. They're also required to obtain economical prices. So some examples of this are avoiding unnecessary or duplicative purchases, using state or local intergovernmental agreements or inter-entity agreements for common or shared goods or services, and then also using federal excess and surplus property instead of purchasing new equipment and property. So what they want to be doing here is that just making sure that the entity is looking out for what is the best way to procure those goods, what's the most economical. They're also required to award contracts only to responsible contractors. So what this means here is that that contractor has the ability to perform successfully under the terms and conditions of the contract. So things that you need to be doing are giving consideration to integrity, compliance with public policy, record of past performance, and financial and technical resources to actually perform the contract. You're also required to maintain records detailing the procurement history. So the items that need to be in these records are the rationale for the method of procurement, the selection of the contract type, the contractor selection or rejects, as well as a basis for the contract price. So competition should be full and open. And this is to ensure objective contractor performance and eliminate any kind of unfair advantage. So an example that they have in the guidance is that of something that would be restrictive is specifying that the contractor must use a name brand, when really a generic brand could be used as well and just be just as good. So some additional examples of restrictions can be found in section 200.319. There also need to be written procedures to ensure that all solicitations include clear and accurate descriptions of technical requirements and all other requirements and factors used in evaluating the bids or proposals. Additionally, they do state that pre-qualified lists can be used if there are enough qualified sources for competition, and if you do have a pre-qualified list, that needs to be a current list. The effect of state law. the non-federal entity must still follow state procurement laws as applicable, but if there is a more restrictive law, then that's going to be the one that is applicable. So you go with whatever is the most restrictive. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about the different methods of procurement. The first one being micro purchases. And the threshold for this and small purchases are both covered in 48 CFR 2.101. And so if you participated in our webinar last year, you will remember that the micro purchase threshold was $3,500. This is probably the thing that my clients were hoping the most would be increased because it is a pretty low threshold. Well, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018 increased this threshold from $3,500 to $10,000. Now, this act says that the changes will become effective when they're codified in the Federal Acquisition Regulations. If you are just looking at this and then you go to the FAR, then you will see that lower threshold. However, the Office of Management and Budget did issue a memo on June 20th of 2018 where they granted an exception to use the higher threshold that was applicable as of the date of that memo. So in June 2018, you could start using the $10,000 threshold. Now, if you do have something that qualifies as a micro purchase, then those should be distributed equitably among qualified suppliers. So you aren't required to solicit competitive quotes if the price is determined to be reasonable. So the next method of procurement is small purchases. And similarly to micro purchases, last year that threshold was $150,000, but has been subsequently increased to $250,000. If you have something that meets this, then you must get price or rate quotes from an adequate number of qualified sources. The next three items are going to be for things that are over the that simplified acquisition threshold, so things that are over $250,000. The first one being sealed bids. So these are bids that are publicly solicited and a fixed price contract is awarded to the responsible bidder. So this means that their bid conforms with all the material terms and conditions for the invitation of the bid and that it is the lowest price. So once you receive these sealed bids, you will open them up, look at them, make sure that all of the bids conform to the material terms, and then the lowest contractor or the lowest bidder is selected. Typically, this method is going to be preferred for things such as construction. Now, Section 200.320 covers the conditions for when this method would be appropriate. The next method is competitive proposals, and typically this is going to be conducted with one or more source submitting an offer and either a fixed price or cost reimbursement type contract is awarded. And generally this is going to be used when the conditions aren't appropriate for sealed bids. So I typically think that this would be for things that are such as professional services, like an audit contract. If you were contracting out for any kind of legal services, this would probably be where a competitive proposal would be better than using a sealed bid. The last method of procurement is the non-competitive proposals. And this method is used when items are available only from a single source, or there could be an emergency that doesn't permit any kind of competitive solicitation. Additionally, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity could expressly authorize non-competitive proposals in response to a written request from the entity, or after the solicitation of a number of sources, it's deemed that competition is inadequate. Okay, so small minority women's businesses and labor surplus area firms. So here it just states that the entity must take steps to solicit procurements from these types of entities. So this should be written into your policies on how you are going to do this. Procurement of recovered materials. This just states that they must comply with Section 6002 of the Solid Waste Disposal Act. Contract cost and price. You must perform a cost or price analysis for every procurement action over the simplified acquisition threshold. So anything that's over that $250,000, this also includes any kind of contract modification. So if your contract modification is over $250,000, then you need to be doing a cost or price analysis. Additionally, you must make an independent estimate before receiving bids or proposals. You must negotiate profit as a separate element of price in certain situations. Costs and prices based on estimates must be based on allowable costs, and then you cannot use cost plus a percentage. Now, if you are a subrecipient, so you receive funds from a pass-through entity, then you must provide documentation as requested for things such as technical specifications of proposed item, RFPs, IFBs, or independent cost estimates under certain circumstances. The entity could be exempt from review if the pass-through entity determines that the entity's procurement system complies with these standards. So next, bonding requirements. So if you have construction facility improvement subcontracts over the simplified acquisition threshold, that $250,000, then there are minimum bonds that are required unless the federal agency or pass-through entity determines otherwise. So these minimum requirements are 5% of the bid price for bid guarantees. You want to note that this must be a firm commitment like a bid bond or a certified check, 100% of the contract price for performance bonds, and then 100% of the contract price for payment bonds. Contract provisions. So contracts must include the applicable provisions in Appendix 2 to 2 CFR 200. So for local governments, colleges, and universities, they must compare federal and state requirements to determine what the most restrictive elements are in order to comply. So similarly to how we talked about before, that you can follow the state's guidelines, but whatever is most restrictive applies. That's basically what it's saying here. You can also use a blanket statement to incorporate federal requirements that if you are doing this, then employees need to be trained on the differences and how to comply with those. Some unallowed procurement actions would be things such as piggybacking, coup purchases, and group purchasing programs. Now, allowed, you can order off a state contract if the state bid it out in accordance with the federal procurement requirements. So if it was not in accordance with federal procurement requirements, you can't order off that contract. And I am going to turn it back over to Melissa for our next polling question.
All right, you are rolling there. Thank you so much for going through some of these really cool, I think somewhat unknown aspects of, especially in this area of procurement. So thank you so much. And I've been answering questions as they're coming in, and so definitely be on the lookout there. We do have a polling question for you. And so is your organization ready for these procurement standards? Mind you, hopefully if you had those January ones going through, that this is something that you have kind of worked through. If you're not sure, obviously that would be something just to check in for. So again, your choices are yes, no, somewhat, and I'm not sure. So just wanted to kind of get a feel from you. Obviously, this is one of the hot topics. Have you been talking a lot to your clients about this, Laura?
Yeah, I would say during last year's audit process, we were definitely talking to them about that, making sure that they were starting to get in compliance with these.
All right, looks like almost everyone has voted. I'm going to close this poll in about 2 seconds. So if you haven't gotten your vote in, this is the time. All right, so let's close this and kind of see where you guys are in the process. And I am not surprised one bit by this. So most of you, 50% of you are there. Some of you are somewhat there, and that's, small victories. And then some of you aren't sure, and we do encourage you to go back. If you're not, for the 1% of you that are out there that are definitely not, definitely reach out to somebody here. We'd be happy to assist you to the extent possible. If you're an audit client, we can kind of see what we can do to help you. If you're not an audit client, we can definitely do some consulting services in this area. So awesome. All right, well, I'm going to send it back over to you, Laura, and I did a couple of questions that came in, so I will start tackling those.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. The next item we wanted to talk to you about are the changes that were applicable to the SEFA. So hopefully these are things that you have already implemented, but just so that you are aware, when it comes to clusters, you are required to provide the cluster name, list the individual federal programs within that cluster of programs, as well as provide the applicable federal agency name. And then also you need to include a subtotal for each cluster. So a great example of this is the special education cluster. So this consists of two separate CFDA numbers, the first being 84.027, which is just your regular special education, and 84.173, which is for preschools. So if something like this is applicable to your entity, you would list that cluster name, and then underneath that have both of these programs and then a subtotal for those. Now, if you are a subrecipient of an award, then you need to include the pass-through entity's name as well as the identifying number that's been assigned by them. So sticking with that special education, here in Virginia, typically those funds are passed through from the Virginia Department of Education, so that would be your pass-through entity name. You are also required to include any kind of non-cash awards. And then if you are the pass-through entity and passing through your funds to a subrecipient, you need to include the total amount provided from each federal program. Some of the changes that occurred for disclosures are related to loan or loan guarantee programs. For this, you need to identify the balance that was outstanding at the end of the audit period and disclose that. Then for your de minimis cost rate, you need to disclose whether or not you elected to use that 10% de minimis cost rate. Okay, so for the summary of prior year audit findings, this is something that you as the auditee are responsible for. You're responsible for the follow-up and corrective action on all findings. So because you're responsible for that, you are responsible for this. So when you are filling out the summary schedule, the reference number that's on this needs to match the prior year issued audit report. So really making sure that when you have your prior year audit report pulled up so that you can make sure that those link together. So if your prior year finding number was like 2018-001 on this year's summary schedule, that needs to be what the reference number is. You are also required to report the status of all prior year audit findings. So if your finding is fully corrected, then you only need to list the audit finding and state that corrective action was taken. Now, if the finding is not corrected or is only partially corrected, you need to describe the reason for recurrence and what that planned corrective action is, as well as any partial corrective action. Now, if the corrective action on this schedule is significantly different from what was included on your last year's corrective action plan, you need to provide an explanation to describe why there are differences between the two. Now, if you happen to believe that your findings aren't valid anymore or don't warrant any kind of further action, then you need to include that reason in your summary schedule. However, it is really important to note that a valid reason is only going to be if all three of the following things have occurred. So it probably doesn't really happen very often when you can state that it's not valid. But here are these items. So the first being that 2 years have passed since the audit report in which the finding occurred has been submitted to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. The federal agency or pass-through entity is not currently following up with the auditee on the findings, and a management decision was not issued. So if you have all three of those things, then you could potentially do this. Okay, so corrective action plan. So just like the summary schedule of prior audit findings, the corrective action plan has to do with the current year findings, and this is something as the auditee that you are also responsible for if you do have findings. So this needs to be a separate document on the entity's letterhead, and then for each finding, you need to include the name of the contact person. So that would be the person who is responsible for this corrective action for the finding. You also need to state what the corrective action is that's being planned to address that finding, and then when you anticipate that the corrective action will be completed. So when do you think that you can have that corrective action in place to hopefully stop any further findings from occurring? And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa for the next polling question.
Thank you. Yes, we don't see a lot of people getting out of having to follow up. The only time we've seen it, I think, in my experience, was when someone did not have have the grant anymore, and then they were like, you know, we don't really need you to follow up so much on this. So
yeah, I've seen it in like 11 years, so it's very rare.
That is typically how that works. So here is our next polling question. So how knowledgeable do you consider yourself with uniform grant guidance? And so we have, I'm an expert, I rock this thing somewhat, I've got it under control, but I'm definitely not quite at expert level, or, oh my God, please make it go away. I don't want to know anything about this, but I am here because I need to know. So no right answer so long as you have selected how you're feeling today. No judgment at all. We are just trying to get a feel for where you guys are in the process. We do this as an annual event, and we hope to see, you know, if you guys think you need it or not going forward. So it's always helpful. So when you do your evaluation today, we hope that you will consider letting us know about topics that you like, anything from here that you want us to continue with as we are going through the uniform guidance. I'll give you about 2 more seconds to fill in that answer, and then we're going to go back to the program. All right, so let's take a look here. It says most of you feel somewhat confident there, and that makes me feel really happy. I know we do a lot of these to help you guys be successful in your jobs, and that's really our goal. So happy to hear that. For the 4% of you that are experts, thank you so much for joining us and sharing in your knowledge. And then for those of you who are not feeling it, it's okay. This thing is a brick. If you've ever had an opportunity to read it, it is great for sleepy time. So. All right, so we're gonna hide that and send it back over to Laura, who's gonna continue to share her knowledge.
So the next topic that we're going to talk about are the proposed data collection form changes. So currently out on the Federal Audit Clearinghouse website, you can go and see what the proposed form SAC as well as the instructions are. And those are currently available for public comment. So I would recommend that y'all go out there and check out the new form. If you do have any comments, then you can submit those on the Federal Registrar website by searching for OMB control number 0607-0518. So these proposed changes would be applicable for fiscal years ending in 2019, 2020, or 2021. Now let's talk about what those proposed changes are. So part 1, this is the general information. There really wasn't anything too significant that's being proposed to be changed here. The only thing that they are proposing adding in is the fiscal period start date. Previously, they have only included what the end date is, so they would only show that you are 6/30/2018 year end. So now they want to know that my fiscal year started 7/1/2017. For part 2, this is the federal awards. They haven't proposed any kind of changes to the detail of the federal awards, but they are proposing adding in the notes to the SEFA. So this would include what your significant accounting policies are in preparing the SEFA, whether or not the auditee uses the de minimis cost rate. That will be a yes or no, check the box, and then they've included a box for an explanation, and they want an explanation included whether you check yes or no. And then they have also included a section for any additional notes that you have on your SEFA. And then this is going to need to tie back to your issued SEFA, the notes to the SEFA. Part 3, this is the information from the schedule of findings and question costs. What they've done here is that they are proposing to add in the following question. Did the auditors communicate in a written document, such as a management letter, any issues that were not audit findings but warranted the attention of those charged with governance? So if your auditor is issuing a separate management letter, then you are going to want to check that as yes. For the federal award findings sections, they have proposed to add in the amount expended for the program that had a finding. And then they have also added in a section for the text of the audit findings. And then this text that gets entered in here must appear exactly as it does on the schedule of findings and question costs in your audited statements, excluding any kinds of charts or tables. So previously, this hasn't actually been in the form, but it's been in the financial statements that have been uploaded to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse website. Part 4, this is the corrective action plan. So this is a completely new section that they are proposing adding in. And similarly to the audit findings text, this section needs to appear exactly as it does in the reporting package, excluding any charts or tables. So whatever is that corrective action plan that you've put on your letterhead, that's going to be what is uploaded exactly into the new data collection form. So like I previously said, go back and look over these changes. If you do have any kind of comments, then you need to go ahead and I would suggest that you, oh my gosh, sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied, then go and give any kind of feedback that you have. Okay. So now we're going to cover some of the exceptions to uniform guidance. So only OMB may allow exceptions. So this is only applicable for classes of federal awards and non-federal entities, unless the exceptions are prohibited by statute. Exceptions are published to the OMB website, but it is also really important to note that exceptions aren't allowed for Subpart S. This is your single audit. So you're never going to get out of having to have a single audit done if you are over that $750,000 threshold. And also note that exceptions can be made on a case-by-case basis by federal agencies. Okay, as far as the Compliance Supplement Appendix 1, this lists programs that are exempt from post-award requirements and cost principles. These exemptions aren't applicable to 2 CFR sections 200.330 to 332 regarding subrecipient monitoring and management or procurement for certain health and human services programs. Then Compliance Supplement Appendix 7, Section 6, OMB doesn't maintain a complete list of these exceptions, so auditors as well as grant administrators should review the program compliance supplement and agency regulations implementing the uniform guidance as necessary to identify any applicable exceptions. For programs that don't have a compliance supplement, agencies implementing regulations for uniform guidance should be reviewed to identify any kind of exceptions. And then if you do have any kind of questions, you can direct them to the federal agency key management liaisons as listed in Appendix 3. So we did want to go ahead and show you what an example of an exception would be. So back when the micro purchase threshold was only $3,500, the Department of Defense in 2017 increased that to either $5,000 or $10,000, depending on the type of expenditure. And as we talked about back in the beginning, the OMB had an overall exemption for all federal expenditures where they have increased that to that $10,000. Okay, so we did have a question come in regarding Omega, which I'm thinking is probably a Virginia-specific system on whether there are any kind of certifications and how we would handle that. So that is something that I probably will end up looking into outside of this, and I can get back to the person who has asked the question. Off the top of my head, yeah, I think I will do a little bit of research and then we can send out those responses. Okay, so next I wanted to go ahead and cover what some implementation issues and frequently asked questions. Okay, so the first one has to do with loans expended. There was a question regarding how to determine the amount of loans and loan guarantees expended. That amount would be the new loans made or received during the year, as well as the beginning balance if the loan had continuing compliance. So if there is no continuing compliance for that loan, then you do not need to include that in your loans expended amount. Okay. There was a question about non-cash expended and how to determine the amount of food commodities and donated property expended. This would be the fair value at the time of receipt or the assessed value provided by the federal agency. For subrecipient risk assessment, there were a couple of questions that they had, the first being on whether risk assessment is required if you have an existing subrecipient who is entering into a new uniform guidance funded requirement. So the answer to that is yes, that pass-through entities must evaluate each subrecipient's risk of noncompliance for the purposes of determining whether that is appropriate, whether they're an appropriate subrecipient. Then they also had a question about if risk assessment is required to be completed before they issue a subaward. The answer to that question was that no, it's not. There is no requirement for pass-through entities to perform this risk assessment first. There is judgment on when that timing can be done. There was a question regarding credit card purchases and whether uniform guidance requires entities to limit credit card purchases to a particular threshold. And no, there's not, but uniform guidance does provide requirements for internal control framework surrounding those purchases and provide guidance on forms of payment. So now we're just going to go into some audit reminders, things that will help you as you are going through your audit process. So the first thing is that you should be aware and also have a process to track changes to compliance requirements. So thinking about things like who is going to be responsible for tracking those changes, it should probably be somebody who's in charge of administering those grants, and then they should be reviewing and understanding all aspects of the grant to ensure that they are in compliance, and then really determining how often they should be reviewing for changes. They should be doing a review at least annually. This can be done through correspondence with their grantor agency, as well as reviewing updated grant summary or grant manual, and then also just every year pulling down the compliance supplement so that they are aware of what the audit requirements will be. Making sure that changes are implemented timely. So once you've identified that there are changes, there should be a process on how those are going to be communicated out to the employees who are in charge of performing those procedures to make sure that they can get implemented in a timely basis to help y'all avoid any kind of audit findings. Also ensuring that there are proper controls in place for complying with the requirements. So thinking about what are the risks associated with that requirement, and then creating controls to address those risks. So some questions that you may want to ask yourself, and these are going to be based on the COSO framework, are things for like the control activities. How are you certain that your organization is in compliance with, say, eligibility? That would be a particular compliance requirement. Then as far as risk assessment, how did you determine whatever that control activity was necessary to ensure compliance? For monitoring, what is the process used to ensure that whatever your control activity is performed correctly and consistently? For information and communication, how and when do you notify people that that action is required? And then as far as your control environment, what is management's attitude about internal controls? So trying to think through each of those things is going to be very helpful for your organization. And then along with that, making sure that the controls and processes that you have identified and put in place are documented. This can really help you to ensure that employees are aware of what the processes are. That makes them very concrete, and as long as they're communicated, it's hard for them to say that they weren't aware of what those were, and lets them know how things are expected to be done. It's also going to be very helpful for you when you get to your audit, because it's going to help you to assist you in providing documentation to the auditors, and probably will make your audit a little bit less time-consuming because you already have those all written out. And then maybe the auditor just has a few follow-up questions. So next, you want to be prepared for your single audit. So making sure that you gather and summarize your grant information, having clean and organized records really provides an additional level of comfort to your auditors. And then knowing whether your awards are subject to pre-uniform guidance or post-uniform guidance. So knowing if they were awarded pre-December 26th of 2014 or after that, so that you are aware of which standards are applicable. And then if you have a good first draft of your SEFA ready for your auditor, that can help in making sure that you get the best first selection of programs that are going to be applicable to testing, so that you don't have any kind of last-minute programs jumping up. Nobody likes it when it's, right before issuance and you get your final version of the SEFA and then a new program has been selected by your auditors to be tested. Also, like I mentioned, having documented policies and procedures helps to drive quality and compliance. It's also good if you discuss with your auditor the scope of the single audit and the nature of your federal awards. And like I had mentioned previously, somebody should be reviewing the compliance supplement so that you are aware of what the compliance requirements are for each of those programs. If cash management is applicable and you have an advance payment, trying to minimize the time that's elapsed between the drawdown of the federal cash and under your letter of credit and dispersing it by check, and then crediting any kind of interest back to the federal government. If equipment and real property management is applicable to the program for property records, making sure that you have those and that they include all of the required elements outlined in subpart E. For your equipment inventory, making sure that you are taking an inventory of that equipment that has been acquired with federal funds at least once every 2 years, making sure that you've reconciled the inventory count to your property records. For things such as reporting, making sure that you have timely, accurate financial and performance reports. Sometimes late reports can indicate a weakness in the grant management systems, and sometimes those could be things that are considered to be red flags that could invite some scrutiny. Now, if you are a pass-through entity, so that means that you are giving some of your federal funds to a subrecipient, making sure that you're able to identify who all of your subrecipients are, that you've performed those risk assessments, that the subawards meet the requirements, and that you have good monitoring files. So lastly, just also making sure that the staff who are working on federal programs are trained in the Uniform Guidance administrative requirements and cost principles. And with that, I will turn it back over quickly to Melissa for our last polling question.
All right, well, those were some really awesome reminders. Again, I think it's always important to have in the back of the mind some of the things to make this process easier, because we know it's not easy, but as much as we can we make it easier? And we appreciate that. So, all right, this is another just quick poll here. How many findings did you have on your most recent single audit? So again, no judgment here, just trying to kind of see where we are in the process. It does depend a lot on if you have new programs, if you have a really complicated program, which there are quite a few of those out there. There's a lot that goes into this, but just to kind of get a feel for where you guys are seeing this and what number you're seeing, that would be awesome. So again, please make sure that you are including the answer to the poll here so that we can give you your CPE credit, and thank Laura for her awesome work here in making sure that you're all up to date. All right, looks like most of you have voted. I'll give you about 2 more seconds and then I'm going to close out this poll. All right, excellent. So it looks like about 65% of you have not had any, which is awesome sauce. Congratulations. 22% of you had 1 or 2, 9% had 3 or 4, and only 5% had 5 or more. So again, findings are not uncommon, as you can see here, from the fact that over 30% of people do have findings, which is a lot to do with the changes that are out there. So we appreciate you guys sharing. That's really helpful information for us. And I'm going to turn it back over real quick to Laura to wrap up, and then I'll give you some closing items there.
Okay, so if anybody is looking for some fun summer reading, here are the sources that we use to prepare this presentation, so you can check those out. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much, Laura. I know this was a ton of work for you, so we totally appreciate the amount of effort that you have gone through today to go through this. A recording is available of this presentation, so obviously please make sure that you are if you need it or you need to share it with someone while they won't get CPE, they can go through and check this out on our website, cbh.com, and we will be able to be able to help you. One question that came in, are entities going to single audit also required to apply uniform guidance on non-uniform guidance funded grants? The answer is no. If you are, if it's not a federal government fund, then you can use your typical procurement requirements, et cetera, are there. There was a question about a loan, but I didn't see it just says, what is the requirements for a loan? So if you have a specific question, you'll see here that we do have our email addresses. So feel free to reach out to us and get any questions here. There's a question about where do we find out clusters. That will be in the compliance supplement. The new 2019 supplement should come out in the next couple of months. So be on the lookout for that. They are listed in the compliance supplement explicitly. All right, I think I have answered all the questions that have come in, and thank you guys for participating. It's been really awesome having all of you participate throughout this process. So we appreciate that. Thank you to Chrissy. Thank you to Laura for making this a wonderful webinar. Please make sure you fill out our evaluations so that we get your feedback and also know what you want to hear going forward. Other than that, I'm going to wish you guys a great rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.